Okay, part three here, War on Terror. We are discussing the violent nature of Islam and what's led up to our current situation. So, by the 1980s, many countries who are theocratic or are by nature Islamic, uh, run by Muslims, whether they are Shia or Sunni, have gotten bolder and bolder towards the West, bombing places where people live, work, military bases, embassies, and the like. And our response has been hot and cold. During the time of President Reagan, when Libya decided to shoot down an airplane, we sent people to kill his sorry ass. We didn't make it. We almost killed him, but that was a time of running hot, as an example. Um, the Iran hostage situation in '79, we kind of ran cold. Thank you, Jimmy Carter. The hostages were returned the very day that Reagan became president. And despite what the liberals want to say, the reason that happened was because they knew that Reagan was not Carter, and that their ass was grass if they didn't give the hostages back. There's no getting around this fact. Whatever may have been working in the works or whatever, no one would have waited until Reagan was president to do it if it could have been done. It couldn't have been done, and therefore, only Reagan could have done it. He didn't even have to do anything. He just had to become president. Now, it's not a coincidence, as you know, I don't believe in them, that the day he became president, the hostages were released. His response to most terrorist attacks was an equal, if not greater, measure of response, once proven. That was his way. It didn't stop terror. We didn't engage in a war against terror yet, because these acts of violence were seemingly unrelated and somewhat random in their nature. They happened with different groups at different times, at different places, at different destinations, or different types of targets. So they didn't seem to have any relevance to each other. And then came the Persian War, the Gulf War. When Saddam Hussein got bold enough, it wasn't enough that he fought a 10-year-long war with Iran to a standstill. He still had a lot of money and a lot of weapons and a lot of things he wanted to accomplish. The tail end of that war, in 1988, he launched an attack on his own people, the Kurds, in a region of northwest Iraq called Kurdistan, where the Kurds live. It's an ancient, peaceful people, mostly peaceful, that were considered second-class citizens by Saddam's regime. And these people were rocketed, shot at, and ultimately gassed with a combination of sarin and VX gases. It killed up to 5,000 people and left up to another 10,000 people injured. These people were buried in mass graves, and the whole incident was supposed to be hidden from the world, but it was discovered. And Saddam Hussein went from being this uppity guy who fought against Iran, much to our pleasure, to being a man who was a war criminal or a person whose crimes against humanity could no longer be tolerated. But of course, the world at large did nothing, because the world at large is run by the UN in many cases, and they are as feckless as they get. And there's too many Muslims in the UN who have voting power to, stop any real action against Saddam Hussein from happening. But it was not forgotten, and it was put on the back burner to be dealt with later. And then George Bush Sr. became president, and then Saddam decided he was going to try something different. Saddam Hussein went after Kuwait for its oil, a neighbor to the east. And Kuwait was this teeny tiny little country. And all they do is produce oil, basically. And they became stinking rich. But they were also somewhat peaceful and benign. And they were a friend of the United States, for the most part. Now, truth be told, the United States gave Saddam Hussein a lot of money, a lot of weapons to fight against Iran, which was our common enemy. To make sure that they were at least fighting to a standstill. If they blew each other to smithereens, whatever. But we didn't want them to lose to Iran, because Iran would then take over Iraq, and they would be twice as big. That would be a problem for Israel and the entire stability of the Middle East. They couldn't win, and so Iraq had to at least come to a draw, which they did. But Saddam got big for his britches, and he decided he was going to pull some other shenanigans. So he went after Kuwait and its oil. That was a mistake, because George Bush was not having it. The world at large was not having it. And so he formed a coalition of dozens of different countries run by the United States. And so we had the Persian Gulf War, which lasted 100 days, which was mostly from the air, shock and awe, and a few boots on the ground, got not only Saddam's butt out of Kuwait, but also got a nice spanking to go along with it. But that's all it was. It was basically that. What he didn't do was take it all the way, because we were not nation building, we were not occupiers, we were not conquerors. All we wanted to do was make sure that oil flowed freely and was marketed freely to countries that wanted Kuwait's oil. Now, they said blood for oil. No, it was not blood for oil. The free marketing of oil is something that was the lifeblood of dozens of countries. This had economical ramifications, and without that oil, lots of places would have had a lot of problems economically. They would have collapsed. People would have starved. It was a big mess. This wasn't blood for oil in the sense that we took over the oil. Remember, when we left the Persian Gulf, they burned all, they set all the, or not all, but most of their own oil refiners on fire. They didn't give a damn about the oil after they lost. We're the ones that went in and had to cap all the fires in the oil wells and the oil refineries. We did that. And when we walked out of that country, we did not take their oil. We did not take over their oil. We set it so that the Iraqi people could run their own oil. It was theirs. We just didn't want them in Kuwait. That was theirs. So it wasn't blood for oil because we didn't take any oil. We just left it back the way it was, flowing freely at market in the market of the free market so all could have the oil as needed. But a couple other things happened at the same time. Because of the gassing of the Kurds, the UN got involved in 1991, and they passed a resolution called 1441. What was 1441? Basically, it was a smackdown of the Iraqi chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons programs. The UN told Iraq unequivocally they are no longer allowed to make any weapons of mass destruction. They could not make any biological weapons, any chemical weapons, and any nuclear weapons. And during that war, the United States discovered lots and lots of caches of weapons and lots of places where it was manufactured. But we didn't stick around long enough to do anything about it. We left that to the United Nations. Oops. When Bill Clinton became president, he was handed an Iraq that was supposedly somewhat handled, kowtowed, somewhat embarrassed and ashamed, and handcuffed, without the ability to, make these weapons that could no longer truly defend themselves in the modern sense. They were a very conventional army, and the Republican Guard was, very conventional type of standing army. And of course, the response for Clinton was to make sure that by making sure that we owned the skies, we had air superiority, then we could control what happened on the ground. And he was dead wrong. We created no-fly zones and had satellite capabilities, but it did not tell us all what was going on. It did not have a full picture of the deceit of Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein had a lot of money, and he treated his people very poorly. There were rape rooms and torture chambers, and people either complied or died or suffered greatly. He was every bit the bad dictator we thought him to be. But we let him off the hook, and then we stopped watching him all the way. When Clinton decided not to leave boots on the ground, when Clinton decided to have no-fly zones instead of people actually inspecting, he let the UN handle that. He abrogated his authority and what was required to watch Saddam Hussein. And it got out of hand. The UN created a department called UNSCOM. UNSCOM. United Nations Security Commission. Or Command or something like that. Which was basically the new branch that was created to have Iraq specifically and other countries looked after to make sure that they are not producing weapons of mass destruction. And of course, what would happen would be with the UN inspectors would go into Iraq, and they would be delayed for hours before they could be let to go to a site that they wanted to go see, while the weapons of mass destruction were moved to another location. Then, of course, they would be allowed to see the site they wanted to go see, and miraculously it's devoid of any proof of weapons of mass destruction. The UN are too stupid to figure out that, and too wimpy to insist that they go where they wanted to go, when they wanted to go, without being delayed by the people taking them around to these sites by the Iraqi officials. Nonetheless, in the years that they were inspecting, which ended in 1998, run by a man by the name of Hans Blix, some of you may remember that name, they did discover lots of things. They discovered that Iraq had indeed dismantled or done away with many means to deliver chemical and biological weapons, and many of the weapons, the biologicals and the chemicals themselves. But a lot of it was unaccounted for, including some, a lot of the chemical stuff was unaccounted for. They only found that they had proof that they had discarded some of it, but not all of it. And they never could find the rest of it. In other words, they knew there was a certain quantity, and they only found this much gotten rid of, but this much they could not find. There was delivery systems, there was chemicals, and some other things, only part of which was discovered. And a small part not discovered. Where did it go? And they never could ever quite get all the places they wanted to go and see all the things they wanted to see. But by 1998, Saddam Hussein had built up his military enough, he had gotten rich enough, and he had gotten bold enough to basically kick the UN out of his country. In a very bold, brash move, he said, enough's enough, you guys are gone. And he kicked them out. The report that Hans Blix and Skim had delivered to the world following this, years of feckless attempts to get Saddam Hussein to, heel to their commands, was telling. And the fact that he still had potentially had these chemicals and deliverance systems was also telling. It was not equivocated in any way. They basically said, without equivocation, he's got them. He still has them, and he would use them. So beware. Our job was not done, and it was thwarted everywhere we went. His report was an amazing example of how lame the UN is, how they allow themselves to get pushed around by the Iraqis and fooled at every corner, and the fact that their job was never completed. Everyone on the planet knew this to be the case. All the Democrats in the United States, as well as the Republicans, knew this too. During the 1990s, during President Clinton's administration, more terrorist attacks occurred. Attack on the USS Cole, other embassies, etc. It was building up to something. Well, something happened early in his presidency that a lot of people forgot after 9/11, or were reminded of it until at 9/11 and forgotten even since. While we were beating up on Saddam, a lot of other countries sponsored terrorism, and new organizations and new groups started to come out of the woodwork, either in response to our beating up of Iraq or otherwise. Are finally the West engaging in a war on terrorism that had been going on forever. We finally decided not to look the other way. They realized they were in for a fight and had to do something about it. And so one of these people who had a little bit of money, came from a little bit of money, who was born in Saudi Arabia, decided he was going to do something about it. In 1993, he did. And in our fourth segment, we'll talk about who that was and how he ended up becoming the most infamous terrorist of all time. See you on the next segment.